Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be back and joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. We were just talking about how busy the summer is, Josh. Are you surviving okay?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm surviving fine. I just think it could be I think it could feel a little more summery than it's...
Not hot enough?
Well, I'm not leaving the house much because of that, so I guess maybe so. Yeah, that's right.
But no, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot. We'll see. Let's talk about it.
So as on the last show we did last week that Josh and I were together for this, today we have a couple of different subjects to dig into. One generated by, pretty recent news, a couple of items, and then another digging into the context of some political events late last week. Let's start with the current events, shall we? Texas legislature continued to get more publicly involved in the continuing reaction to the mass shooting in Uvalde that, took place now almost a month ago.
Yeah, wow.
The House Investigative Committee has had three, I think, mostly executive session meetings. Although yesterday they made some national news. They had an executive session meeting. They had been in Uvalde. They came back to Austin yesterday. But they had School District Police Chief Peter Arredondo testify on Tuesday in executive session. And there was, given the media attention to this, you don't really watch national news much, but there was, lots of furtive footage of Arredondo being ushered into a Capitol elevator and
ushered was the word I thought would be.
Well, ushered by I was going to say something crass and I won't. Ushered by, shall we say, several, though not specified number of Texas DPS officers forming a cordon around him. The Senate committee, Orwellianly named the Senate Committee to Protect All Texans, had a long day of public testimony yesterday. They went for a little more than 12 hours, which included probably most notably testimony from DPS Director Steve McCraw and TEA head Mike Morath. Now, also in kind of linked to this, I think in some ways, certainly, the national bill that we talked about a lot last week on the podcast, that John Cornyn has been instrumental in putting together in response to Uvalde and other recent shootings, looks like it's going to move by all current indications. The 80-page bill, called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, would enhance background checks, give authorities up to 10 business days to review the juvenile and mental health records of gun purchasers who are under 21, and direct a pocket of some decently, I guess one can debate this, but certainly millions of dollars towards helping states implement so-called red flag laws, with all of the kind of caveats that we talked about last week and that can come up again, as well as other mental health intervention programs. Now, this is I think we've referred to it publicly as a minimalist bill. I think I did in the mailer last week anyway, but
it sounds like us.
It's a pretty minimalist bill, I think, in a lot of ways, though there is, by all reports, it's going to happen. I mean, there is the Democrats in the House cannot vote against this. Cornyn has rounded up 14 or 15 Republicans. Doesn't seem to be any Democratic dissension in the Senate worth mentioning. So the bill is going to move.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at sort of the provisions and the money, which you kind of come away and say, boy, that's a lot of money for Medicaid.
Yeah.
And that's really, when you really say this is, a little bit around, the existing laws, which is kind of what we suspected. We can enforce these laws a little bit better. But then a lot of money to Medicaid to deal with mental health issues. And I think, if you're the Democrats at point one, you take what you can get.
And you can't vote against that.
And you can't
this
vote.
is something Democrats have.
No, you
the
can't.
mental health piece is something Democrats have wanted separate from all of this.
Well, and that's the issue. I think you can't vote against it, even if you might say, like, hey, it'd be nice if we could appropriate some money to mental health that didn't totally associate it all with violence.
Yeah, and there's
But,
there's a general sense here that, everybody, needs to say they've done something.
Right. Yeah.
Including many of the, the Republicans who will vote against it.
Right.
And again, we should say, there's still a lot of opposition to this bill. And, as a group, Republicans are more opposed to this bill than they are supportive of it.
Well, and I think that the important point is that, we can say, there's a lot of mental health dollars in this bill. But, the sticking points around these provisions about, expanding what they call the boyfriend loophole,
Yeah.
The red flag law incentives, like those things are still going to be very controversial to a large number of Republicans in the caucus.
Well, and it's the reason that, it will be their public rationale for voting against it.
Right.
And that includes some pretty, prominent from the perspective of Texas. That includes Ted Cruz and lots of other Republicans.
He's prominent everywhere.
Though, interestingly enough, Mitch McConnell is voting for it, though, other sort of people on Cornyn's tier, per what I've read this morning, are not voting for it, particularly John Thune. And
I'm still suspect on this, but we'll
Yeah.
see. I mean, we'll see.
You mean whether it actually happens or that more Republicans won't go for it?
Whether it actually happens.
Yeah. Well, you're kind of on the record as that, so you might as well stick with it to the end.
Well, no, but you know what? You know what's great? I've learned this a long time ago. Being in the position I'm in, I can change my mind anytime.
Yeah.
If I couldn't say things that turn out to be wrong and just admit it and move on, then I can't really do this.
Right.
But I'm still here. I'm still on it. And look, and I'll say context can change, situation can change, but still, those sticking points are still very, very sticky. And the thing is, they move very fast, which I think helps them. But as the other side really starts to ramp up and start to talk about what it is specifically that a couple of those provisions are going to do. And again, it's not a lot, but it's enough. There's going to be a lot of pressure on those other Republicans. That's all I'm saying. Anyway.
Well,
but I think it could still pass. My percentages have changed.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly looking a lot more likely now than it did a week ago, certainly to me, but
absolutely.
And as we started this, for summer, overall, there's a lot going on. So, that is all happening. And I guess the one more on that beat, as you kind of alluded to, that I should have mentioned. And it does look like they are in position to do this very quickly.
Yeah, that's.
They ran the procedural vote through the Senate in the evening. We're recording on Wednesday. They ran it through on Tuesday night. Had 64 votes. And I can't remember who it was. It was another Republican senator who was pledged to vote for it that couldn't make the vote.
Yeah. But strategically, they have to move fast.
Right. And the House is saying that they may even stay a little bit, late if they have to, though they think they won't. We'll see, as you say, how much trouble the Republicans who are against this make. And you could see Republicans trying to delay this in the Senate just to spite the House. Wouldn't be the first time. So as you were saying, for summer, there's just a lot going on in general. The Cuellar-Flores primary race on the Democratic side in Texas 28 was finally settled. The recount's done.
Cuellar-Cisneros.
Oh, I'm sorry. Cuellar-Cisneros. Thank you.
Yep.
And that is, so that's settled. And then there's lots of action in the legislature. State Affairs Committee is meeting as we speak, and we'll have 2 days of in the Texas House. We'll have 2 days of hearings on interim charges related to the electric grid. And this, in addition to hearings of both of the special committees appointed at the behest of the governor, as we've mentioned, they'll be meeting in a special joint committee in the House Thursday, and then there'll also be a meeting of a special joint committee in the House Thursday, which has more legislative capacity here. That is going to be a very interesting long meeting. I would urge people to look at that agenda. It's a real grab bag with a lot of different people testifying, including, members of the, sort of gun safety advocacy groups, who will also get, I think, a slot today and probably late in the Senate
very
hearing.
Late.
Like at the very end would be my guess. There's even a meeting of the 1836. There was even a meeting of the 1836 Project Advisory Committee that was created by legislation in the last session, which we were fortunate enough to catch a little bit before the podcast. I can't help but say to people that I think are likely to be listening to this, you really haven't lived until you've heard Sherry Sylvester, Jerry Patterson, Kevin Roberts, and Dick Trabulsi sort of kick around whether to credit Manny Fernandez of the New York Times or the lieutenant governor with a particularly tasty quote about Texas culture. That happens, I think, about 15 or 20 minutes before that committee adjourns. So if you have a little time and maybe you're having a cocktail late in the evening, I would go and listen to that. It's pretty entertaining.
I appreciated the discussion that was trying to define Jim Crow.
Yeah, that was also very
interesting
good.
and enlightening.
So lots of good action in that committee, which appears to be moving very quickly, and
it was sporty.
They've promised documents, the documents and the some work products soon. So keep an eye out for that. Ought to be good. So let's go back. Josh, I went down to the Senate for several hours yesterday and watched some of that hearing. I know you were watching. You watched most, if not all of it, on the internet. And we should say these Senate hearings continue today. So, the way that they divided the subject matter, lots of talk yesterday about education and technology. Today will be mental health and gun safety. So I don't want to jump too far into this, given that we haven't seen what they're going to do. But I'm curious what your impressions were yesterday.
Well, I think the first thing is it's hard not to come away with, I think that the headlines that led, right? Which, I think, the quote that led was McCraw saying that the response from police was an abject failure. And I think, just as an initial reaction, it was sort of shocking. As, someone who's been watching all this very closely from the moment it happened and sort of reading the accounting of it. And, and throughout it, there have been this sort of, these sort of niggling points where people would say, well, if this, then why this? Or, is this really what was going on? Because that's not exactly, what protocol would be, and kind of so on and so forth. And at the same time as, these questions are going, you're also hearing this kind of narrative emerge from the state. And I think it's also been well covered that narrative has been either, however you want to look at, revised or debunked, or debunked and revised, repeatedly, sort of in the immediate aftermath. And to be fair, and I want to be, I like to try to be fair always, which is just to say, I think in the immediate aftermath of that, of an event like that, it's not surprising that everybody didn't have all the facts. There's something, this is a weird comparison point, but it's kind of like elections, right? There's this expectation that we're going to have millions and millions of people, I'm just talking about in Texas, vote. And then that night, we're going to say, here's the results. Right. And it's like, it's a process. It's difficult. And some people have said, in the case of elections, we should just say we're not going to report the results for 2 days, 3 days, just so people can cool off and just kind of, and just to temper expectations. So when you're a day late. But I think the same thing is, applies here is, and people could say this is a very charitable interpretation, and there's reasons to believe that. But the rush to run out and give a response to what happened and try to describe something clearly, looks pretty foolish in the moment.
Yeah.
That's kind of my first kind of takeaway, I would say, because to have sort of the real description yesterday of what went on in that school was, very shocking, and not shocking from any sort of I know what the best police protocol is, or whatever, but from a moral standpoint. And we talk about adults being around kids, I'm a parent, as a parent, you're kind of in a situation where when you see other kids around and there's nobody else, you're kind of responsible.
Yeah.
And so just from the moral standpoint, there's such a moral failing there that I think, the legislators really, well reflected or not so well reflected in some cases.
Maybe.
It kind of depends. And so that's sort of where I think we pivot, right? Which is, okay, so now we kind of have a better sense of what happened here. And then we kind of get into so now what? And that's where we kind of get to the legislative reaction. You have a little bit more of a reaction to the legislative reaction, I think.
Yeah, as I've said, I think I want to reserve judgment. I want to see what happens in today's hearings. But, I found a lot of yesterday. On one hand, I admire your fairness in this. I really do. You have to allow legislators their human reactions. Yeah. And I think the universal human reaction here, that Director McCraw was definitely channeling, but I would say also planning on.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Was a certain amount of just outrage and shock at just the cascade. You and I were texting back and forth. The cascade failure that seems to have happened here,
right?
And I think it's fair to say that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great way to
failings just continued to trigger and build on one another and follow in rapid succession as this event unfolded. And the end was really, obviously,
and that's part of being fair. I mean, that's like a social science concept, this cascade. But I think it's important to and I was trying to think through this and hear this, but you get to a point where you say why didn't someone sense because in a situation that we know this from all kinds of psychological research, there's a certain, it's not a bystander effect because you're not a bystander, you're a police officer, but ultimately you go along with authority, you go along with, and if basically somebody, if there's a reason to think that somebody's in charge and is doing something for a reason, and that rationale keeps you from running into a room full of bullets, that's pretty human.
Right. And
so,
there's a lot of cross-cutting.
A lot of different ways to look at this, I know.
Things going on here. But in terms of the legislative setting there, lots of clear efforts to cast blame on people, the shaming of the cops that were there, the outrage at the situation with the mismatch between policy and the infrastructure for implementation, with the matter of, the policy being all teachers should lock their doors in a school where apparently you cannot lock the doors from the inside.
Right, which is basically, just as an aside, if you have kids in school, they practice multiple times a year getting, basically hiding and locking the doors. This is what a lockdown is supposed to be. And the fact that, again, the school infrastructure wasn't even in place is,
And so, the reaction to what one was hearing yesterday, had to be, a sense of, had to be very negative, had to be very shocked. But there's a certain amount of table pounding and raised voices from some of the senators that I found a little theatrical and also, and this is where you have to be fair and see what happens today.
Right.
But there is a broader context to this problem in which we're, focusing and casting blame fairly downstream for the failure of policy and practice to respond to a situation that those who have stewardship of the policy environment on guns right now have to have some responsibility for. And what we're seeing in the politics of this, and it really enters into, I think, your read of what's going on in the national bill, is that is just not happening. No. We are not having a straightforward, direct conversation thus far about the impact of gun policies in the state and in the country, for that fact. And, I think that's reflective in the bill we're seeing nationally. It's reflective in a very, that I found by the end of the day irritating, and a word I find myself using a lot more lately, dispiriting way. As I'm sitting there kind of watching the senators have this discussion, and, it was particularly, and that's why it's useful to be down there sometimes. Watching the reaction, watching who's coming and going, does not give you a lot of faith, and this goes to other conversations we've had, in basically the legislature and, more broadly speaking, the political system's actual capacity to really deal, at least not even deal with it, at least even confront this problem in a broad, intellectually honest, to use a word, even moral way. And I think it's pretty disconcerting.
I can't help. And again, we've talked at length here about the fact that, depending on your partisanship, you look at these mass shootings and you just have a very different perspective. You have a different perspective on the role of guns and the role that guns play and access to guns play in mass shootings, whether they are more likely, to lead to mass shootings, and their likelihood to, lead people to stop them. But it is dispiriting, I think, is a great word, right? Because when you sort of sit there and you watch and you think, so, okay, what are we doing, to get ready for next school year? Well, so far, we're making sure that the custodial staff are checking all those 300,000 plus doors.
Right.
And it's kind of like, okay. And to me, I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, and again,
look, that's not a bad idea.
No, it's a great idea, but I guess what I would ask is, if I show up with a semi-automatic weapon like the one that the shooter in Uvalde had, and I decided to start shooting at the door, does that make a difference? Are those doors bulletproof? Can I just start? Or also, as they pointed out, again, very quickly yesterday, a lot of those doors have a bunch of glass panes next to them.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a genius to basically break a glass panel and open the door.
Right.
So, there is just sort of like...
on either side.
Well, on either side. And that's why it's sort of like, well, are we even we're still having these same conversations. I've been here long enough now. You've been here long. We've had these conversations before.
Yeah.
And the policies happen, and the things, and there's been analysis of the policy, and it hasn't really advanced. We don't have an army of school marshals at the 3,000 campuses in the state, and it doesn't seem like we're going to. It's sort of like, it is dispiriting in the sense of we're having the same conversation. And just one thing I'll say, and the committee hearing even started that way.
Yeah.
Right. The chairman came up and said, "Hey, look, we've had these hearings actually a couple different times, and they produced reports. So we don't need to tread over all that ground again." And it's like, really?
Well,
but that exactly.
Yeah, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. Yeah, I mean, I think there was a. And look, I mean, one doesn't want to, shouldn't be naive about this, but the pervasive CYA kind of dynamic yesterday as, people piled on to, the first responders and at the local level, in particular. And again, not to say that, he didn't make some pretty big kind of clear mistakes, it would seem, based on his own narratives, and that he's not been forthcoming about the narrative, it would seem, particularly Chief Arredondo. And, look, here's a person that, unless the narrative really changes and we get a lot more different facts in, didn't make a lot of great decisions.
Yeah.
And has not been completely forthcoming about those decisions in the interim. And I say that just, without being indirect about it. He gave an interview to the Texas Tribune, which is a good get for them. But several elements of that have not held up to subsequent facts that seem to be in evidence. Now, all that being said, to the extent that Director McCraw did a pretty good job of establishing a narrative, that narrative was already being questioned before the committee had even adjourned in a city council meeting in Uvalde last night. So I would also point listeners to that, to that council meeting, which is available on YouTube. I think I tweeted it out at some point, but it's going to be easy to find. And that city council meeting gives you a very, very interesting perspective that is not completely different, but certainly sheds a different light on the testimony that we saw in the Senate. And just in terms of going back to the human element of this, also revealed a great deal of frustration. Yeah. On the part of locals in terms of both the lack of communication from state government after the initial high-profile response. I mean, the mayor claimed repeatedly at that meeting that he's not been able to get state officials on the phone
for
almost a month now, since basically the day or two after the shooting.
Right.
And what the mayor was pretty frank in describing is, and he used the term explicitly as we have here, as, massive CYA on the part of state officials, and seemed particularly unhappy with the DPS's McCraw, but he also had really choice adjectives for the Senate hearings overall. He'd clearly been watching during the day and, thought that what he heard was not good.
And it's interesting. I mean, again, I watched his comments in full, and it is interesting sort of juxtaposing the two, right? I mean, on the one hand, you've got McCraw just, basically discussing, clearly a cascade failure. And I think, one of the most interesting questions that he responded to my perspective in the context of these two versions of it was from Senator Gutierrez, I believe, who asked him, so what matters here? Basically command protocol, who's in charge of the scene, active shooter protocol, engage the shooter immediately, don't wait. And he paused and he said, active shooter protocol. And then you take that and you look at the Uvalde mayor, point out, there are 9 agencies in that hallway.
Right.
Pretty much almost immediately.
8 or 9.
8 or 9. It was 8 or 9. I think it was 8, and then later it's 9. And basically says, he went and he lists through all of them, and he does it in the reverse order, going through from the top to the bottom, where the bottom is basically the school district police department, which has, I think 6 employees and no dispatcher. And it's just to make the point here, it's pretty easy to point the fingers this way. It's not like there's not blame to be had, but there are a lot of people there. This is why I kind of go back to the term moral failing, because ultimately I think anybody there, it seems like, who's been trained, which they all have apparently, would know that, it doesn't matter what this person's saying at this point. There's still shots being fired. There's still 911 calls. So, it's, I'm not sure that, at the end of yesterday, we come out with a clearer picture, but it's also muddy in a different way now, right?
Right. I mean, I think we have, I think we have more we have more facts, more information, more details.
But, to To speak to the dispiriting nature of it, though, I mean, I can just sort of see this now. That you say, okay, so, but now what we do is we go, what we always do, which is we have a mass shooting. We say, well, what were the absolute, very, very specific particulars of that situation? Let's look exactly, was the shooter playing violent video games? Was the shooter on social media? Did they get the guns, from a family man? And then basically any law that comes up that doesn't fit that exact fact pattern becomes, well, that wouldn't have stopped that. And it's like, but that's so disingenuous in terms of what you're talking about, the dispiriting nature of the conversations, which is because the more we focus in on these kind of minor details about exactly what happened and who was involved, it's not that it's not important. It's very important. I think it's important for Texans, it's important for Americans. It's definitely important for the victims' families and all those people to get to the bottom of what happened there.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of like a policy response, it's like saying like, well, we want less murders. It's like, well, what happened in that murder down the street? We should basically, gear our, punitive justice system towards this type of murder. You'd say
somebody killed in a carjacking.
Yeah, and you say like, well, let's make sure we never have anyone killed in a carjacking again. And it's like, yeah, but like people die lots of ways.
Yeah, and just the lack of the lack of any fundamental shifts in thinking about this yesterday. I'm not going to name anybody in particular.
No, but there's no desire to think of it at a system level outside of the way that it's been talked about in the past and the way that they've tried to address it in the past and have been unable to do so.
Well, and just the depth of the cliched responses to, again, we're going to attribute anything directly to anybody, but, ranging from, somebody saying, well, the bottom line here is broken families.
Right.
To, questioning of asking medical professionals if they're talking to troubled kids about God.
Right.
Without questioning, people are going to have their frames of reference. But at some point, some new frame of reference would seem to be necessary here, and I'm just seeing zero evidence of that.
Well, and again, without naming one, and this doesn't matter because you can look it up, but again, cliched frames of reference, someone could go in there with a baseball bat and do this in an hour. And it's like, yeah, but you know why the police officers didn't enter the room?
Right.
Because he had more firepower than they did. Why? Because he was legally able to buy that firepower the second he turned 18, and he did. And so the cops said, nope. So clearly that wouldn't have happened with a baseball bat. But that's sort of, speaks, and I don't want to say it's disingenuous, but it just speaks to the fact of, these frames are just kind of, again, I don't know what's in anyone's heart.
Disingenuous would even, is charitable, I think. But
anyway.
Yeah. So, we've now you spend most of the time talking about this.
No, we can do it.
What we were going to do, we were also going to talk a little bit about the state convention held by the Republican Party of Texas last week in Houston. Speaking of frames of reference, the content of the proposed platform report, which we should say is yet, I think this has dropped out of a lot of discussions, which is yet to be formally adopted pending.
It probably will, right?
I think I would be, there may be some things that get dropped, but I doubt it. I doubt it'll be much, certainly not the things that we've flagged.
Right.
Now the content of this is not especially surprising per se, despite, what we've now become used to is look at those crazy Texans coverage in the national press. I've joked often with New York Times reporters about how, they have an application that they just open it on their phone and it writes those crazy Texans story. Again, to be realistic about this, historically, it's a time-honored tradition for candidates and office holders in Texas as well as national to pick and choose among the platform, and that this happens in both parties. So, no one should expect any party candidate at any level to be bound to any and everything in a platform. But this does give you an indication of where the activist wing of the party is.
Right.
I think as we've gone through this, one of the things that we've concluded is that there is something a little different this year, right? In the sense that, while there are plenty of boutique items in the platform that many Republican voters would neither agree with or find important or have any opinion at all about, some of the most prominently flagged items that, that have been showing up in national coverage, and, people were still writing op-eds about this recently as yesterday, I think, do enjoy widespread support among Texas Republicans. The thing that I think probably got the most coverage was the plank that says Joe Biden was not legitimately elected president of the United States.
Right. And that's something where, obviously, I think the juxtaposition between the January 6 hearings going on the one hand and the Republican Party platform of Texas, like literally in the middle of them.
Makes it catnip.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to look at it.
On top of the usual Texas thing, yeah.
And, but this, the polling we've found, we've done not too long ago, found 67% of Republicans saying that Joe Biden did not win the election legitimately. So this isn't like a fringe view within the party. This is actually...
Yeah. And the national polling's pretty close to that.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, we found 73% of Texas Republicans saying that, the official results of U.S. elections are inaccurate. So, I mean, like those sorts of attitudes are widespread in the party. I mean, sometimes one of the things I've been saying when people have been talking about this is like, it would almost be odd for the party not to acknowledge this sort of ever-present kind of trope, because it is ever-present. And it hasn't gone anywhere, it hasn't changed. The president is obviously continuing to push. And if anything, maybe the January 6 hearings even made it more necessary for them to include it, because in some ways it is something that sort of, I think it's almost a set piece of the politics at this point.
I mean, it's interesting. It's funny in a not funny ha-ha way, but maybe even a little, but that, it's almost as if, there's outreach by this, the base has caught up with the party on this. And I think that, as we've talked about this and thought about it more, I mean, I think, what's interesting here is that, Republican Party platforms in Texas in particular, but, for time immemorial, at least, in the post-New Deal America, in the post-New Deal political system, has always been, Republican Party has been more about, whether you called them states' rights, but, critical of a strong federal role, wanting to limit the role of the federal government. Mm-hmm. But, I think we've crossed from, the federal government is overbearing.
Right.
And there are, unsound constitutional interpretations out there.
Distribution of rights, maybe.
Right.
Or balance between the two.
To the federal government is illegitimate.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that's different.
Yeah. And there's an intersection. I mean, there's sort of two things. So that's, I think, one of the key things to kind of take out of the document. And the other one, I think, is sort of, the summation of kind of what you were saying in the lead up, which is, on the one hand, look, the Texas Republican Party platform having some proposals that draw national attention, not surprising, because it kind of is that's not unusual. It's also not unusual for that platform not to have like a ton of downstream effect. I mean, kind of thinking about it, occasionally it's used as a little bit of a whip. By like county parties to kind of like censure officials who maybe take a vote they don't like. But even then, that's only
or for primary
candidate. Yeah, it's but I mean it's kind of it's sort of
criticism.
But either way, I mean its power is more of an internal kind of playing the game piece of it usually than it is like directive of policy. Now, part of that is because it has basically represents all these interests of sort of, I would say, various single issue constituencies that make up kind of the people who I think participate in a lot of these, participate in this process. And so, on the one hand, I think it's easy to sort of see this and say, yeah, this is another one of these things. People are going to pay attention to it, and then we dismiss and don't worry about it for a while. It's not like
it's only 0.0 whatever percent of the Republican
and it's not like, and
so.
it's not like a bunch of counties are going to go and start, let's say censoring their text sledge members because they didn't, put up a bill to secede.
Right.
Okay.
Although,
but
there is a provision in this platform,
but I mean,
for a bill that would have a popular election on secession.
Exactly. Well, no, that's what I'm saying. Well, so I'm specifically referring to that, but I'd say, whereas historically it'd be easy to say, yeah, that's not going to happen. And now, again, that one in particular, there's lots of reasons that probably won't and shouldn't happen, like practical reasons. But because of the last session, and because of, I would say, the way that the governor and the leadership in the legislature has oriented itself towards the electorate, in particular the Republican primary electorate on these issues, you can't say without fail that these are like, that some of the most extreme provisions are dead on arrival, because ultimately a lot of things that were extreme even in 2019 passed in 2021, things that were extreme at the beginning of 2021 passed in 2021.
Yeah.
And so it's not as easy now just to dismiss this. And I think
constitutional carry for a long time was seen as a fringe interest.
Totally fringe idea recently. And so you take that piece, the fact that none of this is totally dead on arrival with again, what you're highlighting here through the anti-democratic, let's say, thread.
Yeah, anti-small d democratic.
Yeah, anti-small d democratic thread that goes through it. And you say, yeah, this is a little different.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's something that is galvanized there, and the something we know. I mean, I should be more specific about that. I mean, the path that the Republican Party has taken in the last decade, catalyzed by Donald Trump's rise and election as president, which legitimized a lot of these things that were formerly seen as fringe. And we should also say, I mean, we're not saying that, I'm not arguing this is an interesting coalescence of anti-democratic, small d democratic ideology just because they're denying Joe Biden's election. I think that's bad enough. But I mean, it also picks up other streams that have been percolating inside the Texas Republican Party and inside the conservative movement. For example, this is not the first time that the call for a return to, moving away from the direct election of U.S. senators and a return to the model where they are chosen by state legislatures, that's been in there for a while, but it takes on a different kind of flavor,
right?
When it's now supplemented by this sense that, it's the official position of the Republican Party that the current president is illegitimate, right down to some of the wording where, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a couple of spots in the platform where they want to refer to the president. They refer to the current occupant of the White House.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like, I think there's often, we saw some of this by some people on, Texas people on Twitter, where the national press runs these stories and it goes, hey, come on, this is not the Texas Republican Party, certainly not Texas. But I think that argument is a little harder to make now.
It is a little hard. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, that doesn't mean that the hyperbole and, look, there's plenty I can't remember, somebody wrote a column in the New York Times or the Post, one of them in national papers, kind of saying, hey, thanks, Texas, because you made my crazy state, you make my crazy Republican Party, quote unquote, look less crazy. And I think that is sort of, those things are actually, playing that for laughs actually misses something important that's going on here. Let's put it that way.
I mean, one of the things is just, another piece of polling context for this that I think is kind of useful. You're talking about sort of the degradation of, I don't even know, whatever you're going to call it. I mean, I always say, there was a positive attitude towards the federal government, but as you're right, the changing nature of sort of the way that, relationship is thought of in terms of one about, basically where does the 10th Amendment, kind of where's the water's edge on states' rights or state autonomy versus federal authority and all that kind of stuff. And and a lot of the battles for a lot of years have been about where that line is, right?
Yeah.
Not that the federal government is illegitimate to even act in a lot of, or even an illegitimate entity. One thing I was looking back at, and, we ask, occasionally about, attitudes towards the federal government, state government, local government. And obviously not surprisingly right now, when we ask about the federal government, it's going to be very negative among Republicans. But when we ask about during, the Obama administration, incredibly negative among Republicans. But when we ask about during the Trump administration, very negative among Republicans. And I think that's kind of an important thing. It's something, we often try not to attribute everything to Trump because a lot of things were there and he just sort of, but the fact of having a Republican in the White House who basically was sitting there saying, look how terrible government is around me all the time and talking about the malfeasance and talking about how basically any mistake was because it was the entrenched the deep state, all that kind of stuff, the entrenched bureaucracy. Ultimately, if Republicans feel that even with Republicans in control of government, they can't trust government, well then there's never a time to trust government. And that's kind of, that's kind of the...
Well, and there's a critical mass of this. I think that...
remember before the George W. Bush, which...
Right. And I think that, I was thinking even farther back. Ronald Reagan had a lot of bad things to say about the federal government.
Right.
Right. But they also used it. Mm-hmm. Now, Republican sense him have too. But, the other piece of this is that there's what we're talking about is kind of a largely, not entirely, but, sort of systemic institutional, embrace, belief in the system and allegiance to the system in some ways that's being, and to democratic processes being abandoned. But the other piece of that's also very present in this document, and that was also, catalyzed by Trump, even though he didn't invent this, is also the notion of what citizenship, belonging, what the collective identity of the country and orientation of government is vis-a-vis the culture of the country and the citizenship and membership in the community, shall we say. And this is also pushing back hard on that in various parts of the platform in terms of, immigration, views on immigration, the desire to
views on transgender,
repeal the Voting Rights Act of 1965,
equal rights amendments.
Yeah, things on elements of the equal right. So there's a lot of that at work here too. And those two things together, I mean, I think, one at a time, the traffic will kind of bear, I suppose. I mean,
right.
I don't want to downplay the the institutional part of that because I think it is critical that is changing, and I think you do have to have that. But I think one of the things that has made this so powerful and so, striking is that you have a major American political party, which we always thought of as coalition parties competing within a broad consensus on the system.
Right.
Consensus on institutions has broken down. Consensus on the vision of the community, however much it was sort of reluctantly or slowly accepted in the past, has also broken down and all in one of the two major parties.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I think about as you're talking about that. And one is, you talked about sort of attitude towards the federal government, and I think it's important to acknowledge here that this is in the context of a broader decline in trust across society for most of the institutions that we consider to be like fundamentally American. And you can think this is on both sides, right? So you look at the federal government, but you also look at the police. You look at public schools and you see, sort of groups where we traditionally had a consensus of, positivity. And now it's sort of, even libraries, right? Even public libraries are now sort of I mean, this is, you're laughing, but it's true, right?
No, I agree.
And I think, and
every public institution right now is a grounds of dispute.
Right. And I think, hinging that on this idea of, culture, belonging, and identity in this discussion about that. And we've written about this in a piece on nativism in the Republican Party that I think really brings out some of these attitudes we want to talk about here. To me, what I've been thinking about a lot, especially sort of, looking at in both of these stories, looking at Uvalde and sort of the response to sort of a mass shooting, looking at the Republican Party of Texas platform and sort of the comments from the people who were there. And it's hard not to see that sort of belonging culture. And I didn't even think about, the role of the information environment that we're in now. And the point is, and it's not that it's an information environment, it's information environments. And that the fact that there are information environments where, I think one of the writers, I think it was from a statewide entity, basically, just who's at the convention said, not a lot of Fox News viewers here, mostly, kind of One America,
I think that was in the Tribune coverage.
I think that was in the Tribune coverage. And I thought, again, I don't want to overinterpret that kind of man on the street piece of this, but the point is that to the extent that, both parties are consuming more media that does not really cohere or have some sort of consensus about what needs to be covered and what the basic facts are, even if the subsequent coverage kind of varies. I mean, it leads to, I think, this idea, you said, this lack of consensus, this lack of trust, and also, I mean, let's wrap it all up, this dispiriting attitude that we're able to even respond to even horrific incidents.
Right. And so, we've been talking about that offline and talking about it with colleagues. It's come up in here, and it came up earlier today. I mean, there's something to be figured out right now about, and there's got to be a lot of political science on this that's just not top of mind right now, but about, decline in democratic process and decline in governmental capacity to govern.
Yeah.
And not just to govern, but also to administer, including problem identification and solving public policy. The policy process suffers, right? And the two then become, sort of mutually, you get in a sort of a downward spiral.
Yeah, reinforces the view that it's not effective. You shouldn't trust it, right?
And it's hard not to feel like we're in that downward spiral now. And again, at the national level, I mean, Joe Biden just announced, that they want, they want a 3-month, gas tax holiday. And, nearest from what I've done, as of today, it's dead on arrival in Congress.
Yeah.
And so, why are we, anyway, that's a tactical decision and strategic decision in the White House. And also, since it seems like we're probably picking on the Republicans today, I mean, that is just a massive political and policy failure.
Yeah. It's a
political malpractice at a lower level.
It's not a good policy and it's not good politics, and it's who thought it was.
Right. And whose idea was to go ahead and announce this with anyway.
So that's
a smaller example of a big thing. So, all right, with that, say longer than average podcast. So thanks to Josh for being here and for the good conversation. Thanks to our excellent production team in the audio studio in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can find all the data we referenced today and a lot more at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back with another Second Reading podcast next week. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.